Hey everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. In studio this time, we're here in the offices of Skeptic Society in Santa Barbara, California. And my guest today is Matthew Stewart. Here is his new book. He is an independent philosopher and historian who has written extensively about the philosophical origins of the American Republic, the history of philosophy, management theory, and the culture of inequality. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and Harvard Business Review, among other publications. In recent years, he has lived in Boston, New York, Los Angeles, currently based in London. Actually, he's currently based in Santa Barbara.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
When are you going to move to Santa Barbara? Come on, man.
As soon as I can. I mean, yeah, you got the life, and I'm just trying to emulate you.
I know it's a bit of paradise here, I have to say. Yeah. So, as you know, I've had your wife, Catherine, on the show talk about Christian nationalism and the re-rise of the religious right and all that stuff. So I read your book, Nature's God, before I knew who you were. That was maybe a decade ago, on the American Revolution and its ideological foundations. The new book, I should plug the new book here. It is The Emancipation of the Mind. Okay, there it is. Subtitle, Radical Philosophy, the War Over Slavery, and Refounding of America. I think what I like to do is just start with the first book, because I mean, it's almost like a sequel. Maybe you're working on a third volume for the refounding of America in the 1960s.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah, okay. I thought maybe you were up to something like that. But let's start with the first one. So what are the ideological roots of the American Revolution going back to, I don't know, the Enlightenment or ancient Greeks or whatever? How do you think about that?
Well, so one issue is what the people then were thinking, and then another issue is what really happened, and how did what they think influence what we really got at the end of the day. And I think on both of those questions, what I found interesting and surprising is that an essentially atheistic tradition was fundamental. So it was fundamental in explaining why it is that a lot of these leaders were thinking what they were thinking. But more than that, it provided some of the key conceptual, ideological breakthroughs that made it possible for these people, whatever they happened to think, and there was a big mess, it made it possible for them to create a new kind of republic. And so whatever they were thinking, that republic rests on certain conceptual breakthroughs, certain insights. And those insights are best articulated, not exclusively articulated, but best articulated in this very interesting, very rich, and I think kind of underappreciated, underinvestigated tradition. So that's very abstract, but I mean, the big picture, if you put it in terms of names, is I was surprised and very pleased to tell the world about the role of philosophers like Epicurus and Spinoza in the founding of the American Republic. That, they were radicals. America's founders were much more radical than people think, and the creation of this republic was a significantly more radical event than most people appreciate. So that's the big picture.
Yeah, I mean, two themes you hear today is that America was founded as a Christian nation, which you hear from the right, or the 1619 Project on the left, that America was founded as a, slaveocracy or something like that. So let's deconstruct both of those, starting with this idea, America was born a Christian nation. You get people like Marjorie Taylor Greene who act like Jesus was there with Jefferson writing the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get the theme. What were the founding fathers? We use these words today: deism, pantheism, atheism, theism. But what did they mean by those words then? What did they believe?
So the thing you have to remember is that the words change in meaning, and so let's focus on this deism idea. So when you read summaries of what deism is today, it sounds really religious. And it sounds like, they must have been pretty Jesus-y or something like that. If you read it in context, it means almost exactly the opposite. It means that they completely rejected the idea of relying on revealed religion for sources. It means that they completely rejected all the defining doctrines of the Christian religion. And it means that they were grounded in a very rationalist, Enlightenment-centered way of thinking. So I think that's a place to start. And look, they were all over the place. You can't just say, oh, the founding fathers had this one belief system. They had a lot of different belief systems. But if you look at it in the broad sweep of history, you compare it to other things that were going on at the time, other revolutions. It's striking. It's striking just how out there some of them were, and they were willing to say things that we're not willing to say. Like look at what Thomas Paine says about the Christian religion and the age of reason. I mean, it's he would not be welcome in polite society today. So there's that. But maybe we should talk about the Christian nation idea, because in some ways, I mean, my own project was polemical in some way. It wasn't totally that, right? I sort of imagine that I'm a scholar and I write about the actual history and the history of ideas. But,
you are.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. But there was a polemical edge. And so for me, one of the critical starting points was around 2006. I made the proposal for this book in 2005. So, that's how time moved in my world, just in case you were wondering. Yeah, so like a decade before the book actually came out. And one of the motivating factors in that was I came across some of these Christian nationalist historians, and those are scare quotes because they're propagandists and pseudo historians, and I was really kind of shocked because I had a certain basic understanding of the founders and the history of philosophy, and what these people were saying was just kind of crazy. I mean, it was so in contradiction with many known facts. They're saying Jefferson was a Bible believer, right? I mean, and if you're going to pick on one founder as being a Bible believer, Jefferson is definitely not the one to go with, right? So I came across that sort of stuff. The historian in particular I looked at was David Barton. I don't know if that rings a bell, but he's one of these kind of crazy Christian nationalists. You may not know about him, but he is probably the most influential historian in America today because he completely determines the mindset, the historical view of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and half of the Republican Party and all the Christian nationalists. So I came across his work. I was astounded by his, kind of duplicity. I guess there's another way of talking about it. And it did make me appreciate that there was a deeper political movement, at work, that these people were planning something, that they really did. They were engaged in a political process. So an important part of the polemical aspect of my project was to try to put a firmer foundation on this alternative, which is basically the historical fact of the matter. As we know, we've always known that America was an Enlightenment nation, but I wanted that to be more firmly grounded. I wanted it to be richer. I wanted to pull it away from the idea that the Enlightenment is just a bunch of platitudes about, following the scientific method. And I wanted to say, no, it's a serious project. It's political. It took millennia to build up. And we in the United States are beneficiaries of it. So that was, the understanding the threat of Christian nationalism was important to thinking through the foundation of the project. Now, I think that we should pursue the history, and I think we should be kind of proud of this philosophical history of the United States without regard to the fact that there's this crypto-fascist thing going on. But I think that underscores the importance of it, and it underscores the radicalism of the project that we're talking about.
Do you think the Christian nationalists today are purposely distorting history or just selectively quoting people out of context? Here's why I ask. So I'll read the opening of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which I have right here in the little booklet form. And so these are the famous words. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires them that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. Okay, so there's nature's God. Then I pull these up from the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., because I'm on board with you pretty much for everything you just said. I'm thinking, well, Jefferson's my hero, he's like a closeted atheist or deist. And then what you see so I'll just read you the quotes that are right there in stone on the memorial, in the rotunda. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal, hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. On the northwest portico, Almighty God hath created the free mind. All attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burthens are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. At the northeast portico, God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Okay, so you read that and you go, whoa, okay, he's a Christian. I mean, I was shocked when I saw that. I thought, oh, maybe I've really misread this guy. I don't know.
Yeah.
Unpack that for us.
So again, it's just really important to understand these things in context. So it's connected with what I was saying about deism before. So if you understand where nature's God comes from, you understand that when he refers to that, it's kind of a slap in the face to the people who believe in revealed religion. And you will find people writing at the time who are defenders of orthodoxy saying this. They'll basically say, oh my goodness, he's a deist. He's talking about nature's God, whereas we believe in the God of the Bible. So part of it is understanding things in context. A second thing to understand is that people like Jefferson, they did live in a very religious time in the sense that the pressure on people to conform to religion. So let's distinguish that from their actual belief, right? But the pressure to conform was significantly greater than it is today. And so it was very important for people like Jefferson to sort of speak out of both sides of their mouths. And so that's a significant part of what's going on. And so to give you, to make that more precise, let's the one of the quotes you mentioned from the Jefferson Memorial comes from his writings in connection with the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And what he's arguing for there is what he thought was one of his greatest contributions, which was a statute that would prevent any kind of establishment of religion in Virginia. And it was precipitated by something that's particularly relevant today. He said that at the time there was a tax that was being imposed on everybody to pay for the Anglican establishment. And the Baptists, among others, came to him and said, this is unfair. We're paying for this church that we don't believe in and support. And he said, you know, you're absolutely right. We shouldn't use state money to subsidize religion in that way, which is kind of a paradox if you look at the current arrangement, because now through the tax deduction system, we are effectively subsidizing religion. You know, people pretend we're not, but in fact we are. So he was saying that in that context of basically defending religious freedom. And when he says that, when he talks about the tyranny over men's minds, he's actually invoking the argument, almost the words that were used by the radical philosophers like Spinoza to advocate for freedom of expression, to advocate for freedom from religion, that were grounded in what I think is essentially an atheistic form of thinking. And even when he says that God, you know, has made the mind in this way, every time he uses the word God, you can almost always substitute nature for it without changing the meaning. And that's not a coincidence, because he knew exactly what he was doing. He was basically saying, you know, I answer to nature's God. And yes, and let's bracket this. You can argue for a kind of pantheism that's very similar to what we would call atheism, but a little, you know, distinct in tone. But bracketing that, he's talking about a system of thought that is functionally atheistic, that is essentially saying, yeah, nature / God, whatever you want to call it, the universe has created the mind so that you cannot tyrannize it. So you can't force people what to think. And when you try to force people what to think, you just make them behave badly. You create distrust, corruption in society. You just create duplicity. It doesn't work. Sorry, we've had 2 millennia of this. Let's move past that. And to get to that point, you essentially have to do what Jefferson did, which is emancipate yourself from, you know, any form of orthodox religion. Now, I bracketed the bit about pantheism because I think that there's an important kind of tonal thing to get, which is that, you know, like today there's a lot of atheism out there, and I think that's great. You know, but what I want to a couple really important facts to get out there. One is there's nothing new about atheism. I mean, you know, you can find atheism in ancient Hindu texts. You can find it in the very first examples of ancient Greek philosophy. You can find it everywhere. It's a permanent possibility, and in fact, it's kind of the default position of people who want to think for themselves, because you're just rejecting the idea that you have to accept something, some belief on authority, right? So it's always out there. But on the other hand, you have to understand how to, you have to put yourself in different sort of ways of speaking and interacting that sometimes give things a different tone or different flavor. And in the case of the 18th century deists like Jefferson, there is this need to kind of to include in all of these discussions about the origin of the universe and about what's important. There's this need to include this sense of exaltation, of reaching for something, right? And that gets kind of presented as what I'd call a pantheistic impulse. Basically, whenever you hit the end point of your arguments, you basically say, well, nature's made us so that our minds can't be tyrannized. You then say, yes, and isn't that just great? I just love existence. I embrace things as they are, and that's my deity, right? So that kind of deity is just an affirmation of existence. It's in the early modern period in Europe, it was safer to present that as pantheism, to say God is nature, even though in fact it was essentially atheistic. Can I just go on a minute? I know you want to say something.
No. This is great. Yeah.
I mean, this is where I think understanding Spinoza and his influence is particularly important. There was a long time when I myself, like when I was a student, when people kind of accepted this view that Spinoza was this God-intoxicated man. Right, that was the gloss that was put on him by some of the German romantics, and it sort of makes sense if you look at things superficially, if you just read the inscriptions, as it were, because what is the first part of his ethics? It's of God, right? So if you just this is his masterpiece, and section 1 is a proof of the existence of God. Well, there you go. What more need to be said? He's a religious dude. He probably goes and kneels every day in church and so on, but in fact, he was understood at the time by anybody with any degree of philosophical insight or sophistication. He was understood to be an atheist, and he was understood to be an atheist who was promoting radical political and social change. More than that, it was understood that his Republican vision was in an important way grounded on his rejection of these revealed authorities, that the way you get to what we think of as classic liberal ideals, the way you get that is in fact by rejecting the authority, by embracing reason, by embracing the idea that we have to feel our way towards the truth and it's not simply handed over to us from on high. The way you get to that new political order is through this kind of radical philosophy. And so that's why it's, you need to understand that sort of duality, and that goes back to the inscription. I have more in the book, by the way, on the Jefferson Memorial specifically, and some of the language was not quite altered, but there are certain ellipses that kind of make it sound even more religious than it is. And bear in mind that, within a certain atheistic frame, you can actually go along with a certain amount of civil religion. I mean, I want to be cautious about that because I think there's too much of it, right? The idea that it's okay to kind of indulge people in a certain amount of general religious belief, just as long as it doesn't, feel that they're entitled to invoke their deity and oppressing other people, right? And I think that some of what he's doing is along those lines. I mean, he's essentially willing to, toss out enough about the, eternal justice and, Almighty God and so on to
so it's more of
a religious gloss.
More of a literary way of speaking, or metaphorical rather than literal.
That's exactly the word I would use, literary or metaphorical.
Well, Einstein is one of our modern heroes, of course, and when asked, as he constantly was, his position on God, he said, well, the most famous answer was, I go along with Spinoza's God, that is the laws of nature. If that's what you mean, then sure, I'm a theist. But the laws, and that's what this phrase, the nature of the law of nature and nature's God. So are they doing this in a way that's less I don't know, metaphysical or ontological, like, is there really a God or not? Or more just epistemological. I don't know if there's a God or not. It doesn't matter. We want to build a civil society that's just and fair, and we're going to get there by using reason, and we're going to use language like the laws of nature, as if we can understand using reason the way the world really is, and therefore we can structure a society based on our physics, essentially. I mean, this is why Hobbes and let's see, who else did you talk about in there? Well, Giordano Bruno, John Toland, Epicurus, Lucretius. They start with these like atoms or particles in motion that collide and swerve, and then 200 steps later, you have the structure of democracy. It's like, how did they get from atoms bouncing around to how we should structure a civil society? So maybe it's more of a practical kind of worldview, and God is just sort of part of the epistemology or something.
Yeah, I mean, the key epistemological move is to say that basically God can't tell us anything. So, I suppose related to that is we have access to lots of truths, but we don't have access to some single universal truth that unlocks everything. So that's the basic epistemological move, and there are two sides of the same thing. I mean, once you get rid of some sort of supreme authority, which is really just a kind of alienated version of our own consciousness, if you ask me, you also get rid of the idea that there is an unconditioned truth from which you can sort of deductively arrive at every other truth that matters, right? So once you've made that basic move, then I think that the religious stuff, Jefferson's language about God, that then becomes literary and metaphorical, as you said. And it then allows you to think about setting up a society based on what we can know, and rejecting, let's say, premature closure. I mean, let me try to phrase it another way, because I do think that the meaning of liberalism is really important. It's another thing that I'd like to get out there. So without getting too lost in the history, it's really important to think about these general principles. For me, one of the key gestures in liberalism is this idea of correctability. And Popper gets at this.
Fallibility.
Or fallibility and the idea that it's corrigible. And it's based on this insight that we can come up with lots of systems of rules, but we can't come up with a perfect system of rules. That is one that always answers in a reasonable way to our objectives. So that it's kind of a rules-reason paradox. So, we want to live rationally. I think that's identical with living free. But the truth is that our understanding is always limited. It's always conditioned in some way or other. It's constantly improvable. So we come up with one set of rules that works. It works for a time, and then it falls apart, and we need a new set of rules. And so, if you look at it at a very high level, that means there's no system of government that works indefinitely. And even what we call liberalism ultimately gets thrown out. However, the genuine kind of insight and the genuine breakthrough in liberalism, I think, is that it allows to a greater degree than other systems a system of government that can revise the rules in a continuous way that answers to reason. So not answering to like the whims of some monarch, not answering to some code that was handed down from on high, not answering to some set of fixed doctrines which we know are never going to work indefinitely, but rather a system where the rules are constantly revisable. And so I that's the kind of conceptual foundation of liberalism. And I think that America's founders, we were kind of lucky that some of them had this idea. And even to the extent that they didn't, what's interesting is that the context, the political, geographical, and social context was such that they were able to realize, a system that at least imperfectly, very approximately achieved that. And that's kind of the world historical significance. That's what got spread around the world.
That's great. That is so interesting. Let me see if I can rephrase this. Whether there's a God or not, I know this for sure. You're not God, and neither am I. And no one is, because we're fallible. Therefore, the underlying principle is we have to have, free speech, open dialogue, be open to being wrong and correcting, self-correcting, not just my personal life and decisions and what I know, but what society can know, what a political system can know. So there is no correct way to live politically or economically, but that we have to constantly be open to changing it as the future unfolds and we don't know what's going to happen, something like that. And that's the radical break from the past. No one had ever done anything quite like that.
Well, I think that there have been many attempts through history to do similar things. I also don't think that I'm not a big fan of the narratives that say that there was just this one moment in 1750 or 17. Yeah, I think that different societies have achieved different forms of it. But with that qualification, I think that's a great summary. And in fact, I think you should write books about it. Oh, maybe you have.
Well, I'm interested in this, in the sense that, because you get, in modern debates, without divine command theory, if there's no God, then anything goes. What would be the grounding of a right and wrong, a moral principle that's universally true, or at least true for most people in most circumstances, most of the time? That's right and that is wrong without God. Well, it seems to me the heroes of your book have laid the foundation for that. Reason, rationality, we can deduce from what we see about how people actually act and behave. So the examples I use is, would you rather live in South Korea or North Korea, or East Germany or West Germany before the unification, which and so on. People vote with their feet. They tell us what human nature wants based on what they do, and people want to be free. So you mentioned something about what was it, that we have to be free to make our own choices or decisions or gather our own knowledge, and therefore tyranny is always wrong because it prevents people from doing that. Something like that?
Right.
So then we could say, but this system, say democracy, really is better than autocracy. I mean, objectively, absolutely, morally better than this system, something like that.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought morality into it, because I think it's also important to understand the way in which the liberal project is. It's a deeply moral project, but not a moralistic one. So a very common critique is that liberalism is devoid of values. It sure lets people go free, but then it leads them to have empty lives with no belief in something grander, the classic, nihilism argument. And that's usually premised on what you appropriately call the divine command theory, right? The idea that, well, if you're not obeying some moral law that's handed down from above, that has the sanction of this authority, that you can't possibly be moral. And I think that liberalism is grounded on the idea that divine command theory is not only wrong or inaccurate, but is in a certain sense immoral. In a certain sense, it's a kind of alienation of our own responsibility. It's a way of taking your own a misconception of your own interest, projecting it out on some higher authority, and then using that to oppress yourself and other people. So there's a certain kind of irresponsibility that goes with that irrationalism that I think is kind of immoral. But you don't have to take my word for it, because there are a lot of greater philosophers in that tradition that I was drawing on who have made precisely that case, who have said that, in fact, the essence of morality is something close to reason and to freedom. And that the way we become moral is, in fact, to be, simply hold ourselves to account to ourselves through reason, and we do it also collectively. And those two end up being the same thing, precisely because human beings get essentially most or effectively all of their value in life from cooperation. I mean, that's the main thing that distinguishes us from other species that haven't, succeeded in dominating the world and changing the climate. Right? It's this tremendous ability to cooperate. So liberalism is grounded in this other, I think, richer, more accurate understanding of morality and of the origins of morality, and it must confront this alternative immoral conception. And here's one further point I want to make, and it's central to the argument I make in that book. It's that, unfortunately, there's a certain aspect of human experience that lends itself to this false or imperfect, reductive conception of morality. There's something about the way in which human experience typically unfolds that we gravitate towards a certain what appear to be commonsensical understandings of things, understandings of morality, in particular, that are not helpful. Or let's put it this way: that. And I know you're into evolutionary type things that are helpful, perhaps in certain evolutionary contexts, but that are not helpful when you have a large, complex society. And so, it's important to understand that this breakthrough in the modern world, what in the end created something that has made people, on the whole, with lots of imperfections, more free and powerful and materially prosperous and all that. That part of what's happened there has been the successful overcoming of certain kind of cognitive limitations in the way people normally think about things. So in the scheme I use in that book, I contrasted what I called radical philosophy, which comes from this very rich and interesting tradition that I associate with my heroes, from the common conceptions of things. And the common conception tends to go for the things like the divine command theory. I mean, if you ask, if you ask, someone on the street, like why are you good? Why don't you just steal that? The explanation they offer often isn't quite the right one. I mean, let's put it this way: you can often come up with good explanations for why they don't do it, but they will often offer something like, "Oh, well, because then God would send me to hell, and I'd suffer punishment." Right? I mean, honestly, there is this, and I think that's okay as like a kind of shortcut. It's like a heuristic. Yeah. It's sure. I mean, it's sometimes it's complicated to explain why you don't steal stuff, and maybe it's helpful in that context to say, yeah, because if I steal something that, I'm going to be, sent down to this, very hot place.
I wonder if they could articulate why, if you pushed them a little bit, like, how about just because it's wrong? Well, but why is it wrong? Well, because I wouldn't want somebody to steal my stuff, or I wouldn't want to live in a society where everybody stole everybody's stuff, because we would have a civil society then. But why is that good? You can just keep asking why. Like, why is murder wrong? Well, because I wouldn't want to be murdered. Yeah, but why would you not want to be murdered? Which, to me, it's almost like that's one question too many. Like, why would you rather be satiated than starving? Well, because starving is going to kill me and it's uncomfortable. Right. Yeah, but why? Just keep asking why. A little bit like asking, why is reason good? Well, because it works. Yeah, but why? Can you use reason to prove that people say this, theists give me this about science. Can you use science to show that science is right? Or use induction to show that induction works? Or use reason to show that reason works? Thomas Nagel, he wrote a book called, I forget what it was called, but the idea was, that's one thought too many. You have to stop the causal chain somewhere, and it's like asking, why does the calculator on your phone calculate? Because that's what it does. It's designed to do that. The human brain is wired to reason. The physiology is designed to keep calories in for homeostatic balance. That's what it's designed to do. Full stop. Maybe we can get to the bedrock of moral foundations by just getting to some point and say, that's it. That's where we're stopping the query right there.
Yeah, and also remember that with this liberal conception, you also you set aside the idea that I'm going to appeal to some absolute moral values in advocating a particular policy. All you have to do is say that it's in the public interest, and you justify that through appeal to facts and evidence. You don't have to say, oh, because it's the good thing to do. You just say, no, it's good because it's going to help you pay off your mortgage. It's going to help us establish a better system of education, whatever it is. So there's one other common conception that I think is important to think about here in the context of these early revolutions, and that's the way in which people think about political power. So, and you see this now, like in a presidential election year, most people tend to anthropomorphize political power, and that's why we put so much focus on these presidential contests, and that's why people choose one or the other based on personality traits, thinking that somehow is going to express the nation and so on. And to a limited extent, it does. And sure, it's important to have a representative of the nation and so on. But, the reality is that kings, presidents, leaders are always also consequences or effects of things. They're always also, just working with what they've got, and they aren't. When the president raises his hand and says, "Do this," it doesn't happen automatically. He's not a deity, right? That was another crucial breakthrough in this early modern period, that they were breaking from, the monarchical idea. It wasn't just the divine right theory. It was also the kind of political personality theory, the idea that the state is just this one individual, and they were breaking from that in a very conscious way, and that's why the idea of legislatures became very important, and the idea of debate, and the idea that in a democracy you agree to abide by whatever is passed, but you don't actually have to say that it's your identity or your thing. It's just a public policy, and the system is such that if you don't get what you want this time, you go back and fight, and maybe the next time you do. So these were all important breakthroughs, and they involved getting some critical mass of people to think beyond these common misconceptions about the way the world works, about morality, about politics.
And is this rejection of tyranny not just political because they tend to sequester our rights, but that it's also epistemological? No one person can possibly run a country. You have to have a complex system set up that can be constantly changing conditions. No one person can do that. Therefore, it's epistemologically a flawed political system.
Yeah, that's right. And what a lot of theorists at the time, people like Thomas Paine, understood is that a monarchy is not just one guy sitting on top and just giving orders and people doing whatever it is he says. It's actually one guy who's got a bunch of deals with a bunch of other people, like, I'm going to give you money that I steal from the taxpayers, and you're going to then reinforce my power. And, so I'll give you something of what you want, you give me something of what I want, and the net of it is that we screw everybody else, right? But of course that constrains very much what kinds of decisions they're going to make, which are basically bad decisions, and it produces a corrupt political order.
Bad for the political, not bad for them.
Bad for like the aggregate, yes, of humanity. Right? It's good for them, but
what would they have called themselves? Today these words have become so loaded. I don't even call myself a liberal anymore. I call myself a classical liberal, so I can get back to the Jefferson. What would they have called themselves, or did they use language?
They didn't use liberal for sure, because that's a later invention. The Republican is one of the key words that they used, and it just meant that you accept that, in a way, it's code for government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. That's the most important thing. It's been hijacked recently to refer to Republican virtues, but that's a bunch of reactionary conservatives saying silly things. It mainly meant not a system of authority based on a incorrect epistemology that derives all meaningful statements of value and fact from higher authority. So I would say Republican is a key word. I think deist was another key word, and it's for us it's religiously inflected, but you have to understand that in that context it tended to be used by the people who were very much proponents of religious freedom. So I don't think you can accurately characterize it as a kind of a religious political conception. It's a certain political theology, but it's a political theology that excludes religion from the public sphere. Okay,
another phrase that bothers me in the Declaration of Independence: we hold these truths to be self-evident. Oh yeah? Why is it self-evident? Why can't I ask, what's the evidence for this, or the proof that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator, certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness? How do you know?
No, that's good. I mean, but to be fair, that's a preamble.
Yeah.
Limited to one sentence.
Right.
What I want to make clear, and this is why I write 500-page books, is that there's a lot of philosophy that preceded that explains why you would think of people as being equal.
What is that? Go ahead. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, well, I can give you 2 pages now.
Okay. Happiness. Why is that important? And and all that.
Well, let's cover a couple things in the language of that. So it says that the people are endowed with these rights by their Creator, right? And that's often invoked by Christian nationalists. I mean, it's Creator. I mean, come on, how much more religious do you want to get? Interestingly, in Jefferson's first draft, there is no creator, right? So they're just endowed in that equal creation. So he actually has it in a passive voice. You don't assume that there is a creator at all. And as I argue in more depth, it's this talk of creation in that context, essentially, it's done in a way that makes no difference between creation and creator. That basically nature and God are just two ways of talking about the same thing. So that's one important context to understand, and that's something that a lot of reactionaries today, almost willfully misunderstand. They're basically, oh, it's endowed right. So we only have our rights because God gave us these rights. If God hadn't been around, Jesus hadn't been around to say you have these rights, well, then you wouldn't have those rights. And that's just, it's preposterous. It's just not true, because we'd have those rights whether or not their fictional being gave them to us. But more than that, it's not even what people like Jefferson meant. Then to go a little bit farther into it, it's the equality thing sounds to us like a kind of moralistic claim, because I think our thought process goes like this. We say, okay, people are not equal, obviously. Some people are taller, some people are smarter, some people are, just not so able, whatever. So people are not equal. So if we're saying people are equal, then we must be invoking some sort of moral command, because otherwise we wouldn't treat them equally. But there is a long tradition in the philosophy explaining why, when you talk about natural equality, it is in fact quite reasonable to think of human beings as being essentially equal. And here it gets very kind of convoluted, but there are a couple of important sort of perspectives to bear in mind. One is that the equality that matters in a natural context has more to do with people's ability to screw things up than it does with their ability to get things done. So Thomas Hobbes, for example, he's hardly an idealist. He hardly thinks that all people are the same height or something like that. But he basically makes the point that if you don't have a society in his case, he argued with a Leviathan ruling it, that basically anybody can kill anybody else, or any two people can kill any other one person. So no one's more than twice as good as anybody else, because basically everyone in an alliance with one other person has the ability to screw things up or to mess up society. So to some extent, it's just, and if you think about it in a more positive light, it's how do you ensure cooperation among people? Well, you ensure it by acknowledging that they all have the power to, screw up the cooperation, and so you have to treat them as equals, because otherwise you won't secure their cooperation. So they are, in fact, equals in a natural sense. So that's one perspective to bear in mind. Another perspective to bear in mind is that when you're legislating in this way, you're coming up with a political theory, you're not talking about individuals. I mean, if you and I were to form a society, we might actually, take into account the fact that you're so much smarter than I am, or that, we might actually, tailor it to our specifics, whatever. But we're not doing that, right? We're legislating not just for the people who happen to be alive now, but for generations to come, for our great-grandchildren and so on. So you have to bear that in mind. You have to say, someone 3 generations from now, are we going to know whether they're better or worse than someone else? And the answer is no. And then a third perspective to bear in mind is that all of these things are very, human beings are self-aware as they construct political regimes. And if you try to construct a political regime based on the idea that people are unequal, given especially those first 2 conditions, I think you create an inherently unstable system. And this is something that these natural rights theorists understood, that because humans are reflective, you need to, in a way, respect their dignity. You need to have that mutual regard as equals, that mutual respect built into your system in order to create a viable, functioning, or let's say a maximally effective political system. You can do alternatives, and in fact, most of human history is littered with the alternative. Most of human history is, hey, pharaohs are like gods, okay, and you are not a pharaoh, you are not godlike, and there are intermediary beings and so on, and of course there's transmigration, so you can hope to move up a level and so on. So a lot of human history is based on a very different conception, but then a lot of human history is full of misery and it's full of oppression. And the decisive breakthrough that was manifested, not for the first time I insist, but that came through in these early modern revolutions, was this idea of building the mutual regard as equals into the system. And I think that that's critical to liberalism. And also, by the way, to get to your point about labels, it's part of the reason why liberalism is an inadequate label, because properly understood, the thing that we're talking about when we talk about liberalism includes a certain conception of equality. Whereas a lot of proponents of what's called neoliberalism and libertarianism and so on like to pretend that equality just is a absolutely minimal thing and isn't really central, and what really matters is just making sure that everyone's free to do what they want. But the liberal conception, it's not that it sees a trade-off and it favors trading off a certain amount of liberty for equality. It's rather that it sees genuine freedom, real rational self-realization as being, in an important sense, conditioned on this mutual regard as equals.
It's almost like,
sorry, it sounds kind of grand if I say it that way.
oh, I love it. It's great. It's almost like they're setting up a system, like a science of how to structure a society, and each of the units in the society, we'll call them people instead of atoms. But I don't know who they are. It doesn't matter who they are. They're each equal units in the society. And so there's nothing special about me just because I happen to be me and you're not, or the land I'm standing on is special because, I'm standing on it and you're not. We got to neutralize that, almost like Rawls's, veil of ignorance. I don't know which group I'm going to be in. So we have to structure the laws such that all groups get treated equally. Here's what you write. Again, I would read the book, but I only have the audio edition, which I just re-listened to the second time. It was great. I will argue that radical philosophy of America's founders remains the best way to explain the persistence, the power, and the prosperity of the modern liberal order around the world to this day. Ever since Plato conceived of his republic, people have speculated about what might happen if philosophers should rule the world. We no longer need to wonder. That's really great. Okay, maybe it's a transition to the new book. All right, then how did they get it so wrong on enslaving people? Are you kidding me? What were they thinking? Isn't that like the most obvious? If you have to put people in chains and beat and whip them to keep them there, isn't that kind of a sign that they don't want to do it?
Yeah, I did take on that second book project to kind of grapple with that issue, and I in no way intend to apologize for what those founders did insofar as they perpetuated the system of slavery, and I also think it's fair to say that. That system was not disentangled from the system of government that they set up. So there's a lot of criticism that's well deserved, but there is something more. I mean, there's something important that happened in the fight over slavery, and I guess for me the most important part, insofar as it relates to America and what America is and American history, is that it's just wrong to identify the American achievement with one particular point in time. It is, in fact, a process that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, but that has at least enough times to deserve attention gotten it right. And the crucial part of that process, I think the most important example of that is the war over slavery. You can look at it pessimistically and say, well, you only had to have a war over slavery because they didn't abolish it when they set up this republic based on freedom to begin with. You can take a more optimistic view, which is that, well, they at least got rid of it and so corrected things. And then you can take it as another pessimistic view, is, well, they didn't really entirely get rid of it, or they allowed it to morph into other forms that, even if they're not quite as pernicious, are devastating in their own way. And I don't think there's an easy answer on those, but I do think that it's important to get the story of ideas right here. And I think a lot of the narratives that get traded around this sequence, I think are well, I'm going to say it, they're wrong. They're misguided. So one is, you mentioned like the 1619 associated idea that there's this kind of permanent race war. It's always been, one race against another. And there were just different ways of encoding that, a white supremacist project. There's not, there's some amount of evidence you can bring to make that plausible, but I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's a complete representation of what went on. It's also a really bad idea in some ways because it mistakes, I think, some of the most valuable lessons from the American past. The contrary idea that the founders got it all right, and there was just this little mistake of slavery on the way. That's also too simple and naive.
All right, Matthew, thank you for your work. I do hope you do a third volume, and so we can make it a trilogy, and then a box set like Harry Potter.
Yeah, it'll be used to punish people.
All right, that's a good place to stop.